Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving deep into the really profound shockwaves that followed the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Specifically, we're looking at the dynamics around the alleged killer, Tyler Robinson's, first court appearance back on September 16, 2025. The material here presents a stark conflict, and it demands we ask I think, a critical question. To what extent did the intense, highly politicized societal reaction actually compromise the integrity and, well, the constitutional fairness of the legal process that followed? I'm going to argue that the inherently political nature of this crime, it didn't just justify, it demanded the strong systemic response we saw. It was essential for defending political discourse itself.
And I'll be taking the opposing view, that the rule of law, it must be insulated from that kind of political hysteria. I think the government-led efforts, both to politicize the motive and, frankly, to suppress dissenting or critical speech, created a really toxic environment, an environment that risked, and I'd argue likely severely impaired, Robinson's fundamental right to due process and a genuinely fair legal setting, regardless of, the severity of the alleged actions.
Okay, so let's start with the nature of the crime itself. This wasn't some private dispute, right? It was a targeted act, an act of political violence against a figure who, lived and breathed public, often contentious political expression. We're talking issues from the Second Amendment all the way to Christian nationalism. So when the prosecution moved really immediately to seek the death penalty, they based it on specific, legally defined aggravating factors. These included the core allegation that Robinson targeted Kirk specifically for his political views, and crucially, acted knowing that children would witness the assassination. The political framework here, it isn't really an option. It's just woven into the very fabric of the charges. I think Governor Cox was absolutely correct to frame this as an attack on, quote, the American experiment. The urgency we saw, the broad condemnation, it was a necessary act of societal self-defense, really, establishing that vital public safety context against political extremism before the legal machine could even properly start its work.
I do see why you'd say the political context is unavoidable. But I argue that the sanctity of the judicial system, its real strength, is measured precisely by its procedural rigor, especially when that political pressure is at its absolute maximum. Look at Robinson's appearance before the Utah County Justice Court. The process? Well, it was immaculate. Judge Tony Graff strictly followed the letter of the law. You had the formal charges read out: murder, felony discharge, 2 counts of obstruction and witness tampering, and violence in the presence of a child. Robinson was held without bail, deemed indigent, and immediately guaranteed a public defender. And critically, the court immediately required the assigned attorneys to submit outlines of their specific qualifications for handling a capital case. That meticulous procedural commitment, that's the core strength of the rule of law, protecting the defendant's rights.
Particularly the executive branch's overt threats against critics of Kirk. Legal experts pretty much universally describe this as jawboning, using regulatory threats instead of actual law, and creating a severe and immediate erosion of First Amendment free speech rights.
Okay, you raise an undeniable point about the technical adherence to procedure, within the 4 walls of the courtroom. But the courtroom doesn't exist in a vacuum, does it? We have to reckon with the environment the judge was actually operating in, which was frankly a digital ecosystem that had become actively hostile to justice. The immediate aftermath saw the assassination video broadcast globally. It reached millions, literally moments after the shooting. Platforms like X, they refused to label the content as violent or restrict autoplay. They effectively amplified the murder into a spectacle. Governor Cox rightly called social media a cancer on our society in that context. The environment was already corrupted by this unregulated spectacle, by violence, by extremist content, and this systemic failure of regulation, I believe, mandated a systemic response from state leaders.
This whole context of digital extremism is profoundly material to the threat posed by politically motivated violence, and it influences every judicial consideration of the crime's impact and, the necessary measures for public order.
Right, but I come at that digital toxicity from a slightly different angle. If the system was corrupted, it wasn't just by the violent videos themselves. It was corrupted by the deluge of misinformation. Misinformation specifically designed to prejudice the case, and let's be blunt, demonize entire groups of people.
Moments after the shooting, you had false rumors circulating, trying to link multiple, completely innocent trans individuals to the violence. And even more dangerously, there was that unverified Wall Street Journal report. It cited an ATF bulletin, later shown to be false, claiming inscriptions on the bullets were related to transgender ideology. Now, this narrative was immediately seized upon by major figures demanding political action against the trans community. This misinformation campaign, it actively poisoned the well for jury selection. It complicated the defense right from the get-go. That is the contamination we should be most worried about.
The court's strict procedural focus in that light was really the only thing preventing the legal process from being completely swept up in a witch hunt fueled by political opportunism and these digital lies. Forensic reality, the actual evidence, has to override manufactured political convenience.
I understand the danger of manufactured narratives, I do. But I'm not convinced that focusing purely on the misinformation addresses the root problem here. The core issue was the virulent strain of political extremism that was actually celebrating this murder. And that required an intervention, some kind of response, to restore basic civic standards. You look at the polling data, 87% of the American public agreed that political violence was a serious problem. So, the executive actions, yes, they were aggressive, but they were arguably a direct response to a demonstrable collapse of civility. When Vice President J.D. Vance encouraged listeners to call the employers of critics who celebrated Kirk's death, or when the Secretaries of the Army and Navy issued direct warnings to service personnel against mocking the assassination, they were attempting to re-establish a boundary.
I don't think this was fundamentally about silencing legitimate dissent. It was about condemning the open celebration of murder as a political tactic.
See, you're framing state action as necessary moral suasion to restore civility. But that characterization, I think, entirely ignores the chilling effect of government leveraging its regulatory might to silence dissent. That reaction crossed a very clear red line and set up, frankly, dangerous new precedent that fundamentally undermined the First Amendment. Let's look at the clearest example. FCC Chair Brendan Carr explicitly threatening ABC's broadcast license over remarks made by Jimmy Kimmel, remarks that were criticizing the politicization of Kirk's death, not celebrating it. That is an undeniable use of constitutional pressure point. Legal expert Eugene Volokh confirmed it. Mocking assassination is protected by the First Amendment, however distasteful they might find it. And yet, following those threats, Jimmy Kimmel Live was suspended indefinitely. This wasn't some grassroots movement demanding decency.
This was state officials using the power of regulation, the threat of license revocation, to target specific media outlets. As other legal analysts pointed out, when employers subsequently fired staff for comments, they probably weren't acting just voluntarily out of moral conviction. They were likely acting out of fear of government's wrath or maybe trying to curry favor. The state used its regulatory power to ensure critics, even those just mocking the situation, not celebrating the killing, would face severe economic and professional consequences. That's coercion. It's not civility. And that creates a legal environment where the defense is constantly looking over its shoulder.
Well, I might argue that those examples actually highlight the depth of the crisis, not necessarily a simple constitutional overreach. When political figures are murdered and you have elements of the public actually cheering, the government feels, perhaps, is morally obligated to act decisively to preserve the very norms that underpin a functioning democracy. Maybe the government's role shifted under extreme pressure from just maintaining order to actively defining the boundaries of permissible discourse. Furthermore, this dynamic, it directly impacts the prosecution's strategy regarding motive. You simply can't separate the political reaction from the political motive inherent in this case. Remember, the prosecution is seeking the death penalty, and to prove those aggravating factors, they absolutely must demonstrate intent tied to Kirk's political identity. We know the physical evidence is sound. Robinson's DNA matched samples on the rifle, towel, on a screwdriver found on the rooftop. Okay. But the motive provides the why. Robinson's own mother told investigators her son had become significantly more, quote, pro-gay and trans rights oriented. This puts him in direct ideological conflict with Kirk's, let's face it, inflammatory and often targeted rhetoric on LGBTQ+ issues. And just before his death, Kirk publicly defended gun deaths as a necessary cost for the Second Amendment, a stance that likely inflamed his opposition. The prosecution needs to present this entire ideological backdrop to the jury. To just remove the political context, to claim the judicial process must be sterile, would fundamentally weaken the state's case for capital punishment, a case based specifically on the targeting of political expression. The political environment, however toxic it became, is where the crime was conceived, and therefore it's where the crime must be prosecuted.
I appreciate the necessity of establishing motive, I really do, particularly in a capital case. But the question is, who should establish that motive, and crucially, when? The rush by political leaders, Governor Cox notably among them, to definitively attribute the crime solely to Robinson's alleged leftist ideology almost immediately after the event risks reducing a complex criminal investigation to a simple political indictment before any evidence had really been vetted in court. This kind of pre-trial narrative setting, driven by high-profile political figures, it creates an undeniable threat to the fairness of the trial itself. Think about it. If the defense wanted to introduce complex factors, maybe mental health issues, or other mitigating circumstances beyond just a simple ideological vendetta, they'd be fighting uphill against a pre-existing state-sanctioned narrative, a narrative that has already defined the defendant as a purely political extremist. This rush to judgment, it prejudices the potential jury pool based purely on ideological grounds, rather than allowing the forensic evidence, the DNA, the ballistics, the actual planning, to guide the search for truth, which is, after all, the singular purpose of the court. The legal system is perfectly capable of handling political crimes, but it requires insulating the judicial process from political hyperbole. We need to ensure the evidence, not the punditry, is paramount.
But if the political hyperbole, as you call it, is potentially what drove the defendant to act, then isn't ignoring it ignoring the key element of the crime itself? The assassination of Charlie Kirk was, I think, a defining moment precisely because it exposed that immediate, dangerous intersection of political extremism and lethal violence in American discourse. The intense reaction, the fear, the viral spread of violent ideology, the explicit political targeting, it's all intrinsic to the definition and prosecution of this crime. And society arguably needed to react aggressively to protect its own political norms.
Conversely, I think the most enduring lesson from this chaotic aftermath is the alarming vulnerability of our constitutional principles when they're challenged by state-sanctioned political pressure. While the political condemnation was certainly loud and immediate, the true strength of the legal system was demonstrated through its quiet, rigorous adherence to due process, securing qualified counsel, holding fast to procedural standards, demanding evidence. That commitment, that stands as the indispensable bulwark against the very political fervor that threatened to compromise the fundamental fairness of the trial environment.
So this event really forces us to navigate an incredibly difficult choice, doesn't it? It's the responsibility to prosecute a highly visible, politically motivated crime vigorously versus, well, the absolute necessity of serving justice without sacrificing procedural purity to the demands potentially of political persecution. That tension, the tension between society's right to condemn political violence and the individual's absolute right to due process, that remains the central and perhaps still unresolved tension in this defining national tragedy.